Picture the dock at dawn, mist coming off the lagoon, the smell of pine tar and cut oak, hammers ringing against a half-finished hull, a master shipwright walking the strakes like he's reading a book only he can see. It looks like the birth of an empire, one plank at a time. Here's the number that punctures it. In Venice in the early 1400s, a single war galley cost roughly 1,100 to 1,700 ducats to build and rig, at a time when a skilled shipyard carpenter earned about 20 to 32 soldi a day, or somewhere around 30 to 40 ducats a year if he worked steadily. That means one galley hull could eat somewhere between 30 and 50 years of a master craftsman's total wages before a single sail went up. The romance is real, so is the fact that almost nobody who actually swung the adze got rich doing it. We're going to build a medieval shipyard from the ground up, the land, the tools, the labor, the wood, the customers, and find out whether the person who owned it could actually get rich, and if so, which person that was. Drop the mental image of a single dry dock building one ship at a time for a lone customer. Strip it out completely, because it's wrong for almost every private shipyard in medieval Europe, and replace it with something closer to a seasonal construction contractor who works out of a rented waterfront lot. The best documented case we have is Venice, and specifically the private boatyards, called squari, that operated alongside, and in the shadow of, the state-owned arsenal. The arsenal itself, expanded into the Arsenale Nouveau in the 1320s, was a state shipbuilding complex covering close to 60 acres and employing at its peak several thousand workers. That's not our business. That's a government defense contractor, and it's a useful contrast, but it's not what an ordinary person could own. The real medieval shipyard as a private business was a squero, a small, often family-run yard renting a strip of shoreline, building and repairing merchant vessels, cargo galleys, round ships, fishing boats, under contract for merchants, guilds, and occasionally the state itself, when the arsenal needed to subcontract overflow work. Venetian historian Frederick Lane, whose archival work on the arsenal and the guilds remains the backbone of what we know about this trade, documented wage records and contract prices pulled from the city's surviving guild statutes and account books. I'll flag clearly when a number comes from that kind of documented record versus when I'm reconstructing a plausible figure, because for a business this old, honest reconstruction is most of the job. A squero owner in 14th century Venice wasn't building luxury one-offs. He was running something closer to a small contracting firm that happened to specialize in wood, pitch, and water. It's worth sitting with how different that is from the mental image most people bring to this topic. We picture one genius craftsman, alone, shaping a single legendary vessel over years, the way popular history likes to frame a cathedral mason. The reality documented in the guild statutes is closer to a modern subcontractor, on a rotating slate of jobs, sometimes building, more often repairing, always juggling more than one client relationship at once, because no single new build contract came often enough to keep the lights on by itself. The squero had to sit directly on tidal water, with a sloped foreshore, the campo, where a hull under construction could be built up on land and then slid down into the lagoon for launch. That single physical requirement did almost all the work of deciding where a shipyard could exist, and who could own one. In Venice, the best sites were in the sestieri of Dorsoduro, where the Rio di San Trovaso and similar canals gave direct, sheltered access to open water without the currents of the Grand Canal itself. A shipyard needed roughly 150 to 300 feet of waterfront frontage, and enough depth behind it, 60 to 100 feet, for timber stacks, a covered workshed, and the sloped launch ramp. That's not a huge footprint by modern standards, maybe a third of an acre, but it had to be exactly the right third of an acre, and there were only so many stretches of low current, deep enough shoreline in the entire city. This is the same logic as a modern car wash needing a corner lot with street visibility on two sides. The use dictates an extremely narrow set of acceptable locations, and that scarcity is baked into the price before a single tool is bought. Land that could take a keel and a tide was worth more per square foot than land that couldn't. Full stop. There's a second location factor that mattered almost as much as the water itself: proximity to the arsenal and to the merchant docks of the Rialto. A yard tucked too far from where ship owners and state officials actually walked their business missed out on the casual conversations that turned into contracts. Distance from the customer wasn't just an inconvenience in an age of foot traffic and word of mouth. It was the difference between hearing about a mobilization contract the week it was announced or the week after every other yard had already been staffed up. Before the yard could build anyone else's boat, someone had to build the yard. The core physical plant was modest by the standards of a cathedral or a palazzo, but it wasn't free, and most operators didn't own it outright. The structures were simple. A squero was typically an open-sided timber shed, the T's, with a steeply pitched roof to shed water and keep sawn lumber dry, built on wooden piles driven into the mud, standard Venetian foundation practice for anything near the water. Reconstructing from period building cost data for comparable timber structures, a modest shed of this kind likely ran somewhere in the range of 40 to 80 ducats to erect, using local labor and alpine larch or oak piling. At 30 to 40 ducats, representing a year of a skilled craftsman's wages, that's roughly 1 to 2 laborer wage years just for the shelter over the hulls. But here's the detail that matters more. Most squero owners didn't buy the land. They leased it, often from a religious confraternity, a noble family, or the state, which controlled much of the developable shoreline. Lease terms documented for comparable Venetian waterfront artisan sites ran on multi-year contracts with annual rent, frequently payable partly in cash and partly in service, meaning the shipyard owner might owe the landlord priority access to repair work on the landlord's own boats. This is the medieval version of a percentage lease, and it shifted the largest capital cost, the land itself, off the operator's books entirely. The person who owned the waterfront got rich slowly and safely. The person who ran the yard on top of it took on all the operating risk for a smaller, faster-turning slice of the money. Even the shed wasn't always a clean, one-time purchase. Piling driven into lagoon mud rotted, roof timbers needed replacing after storms, and the launch ramp itself, the sloped stone or packed earth surface a hull actually slid down on, wore out under the repeated weight of a hull being hauled up and launched. Call it ongoing maintenance capital, a slow drip of a few ducats a year that never shows up in any single dramatic figure but that, compounded over a working lifetime, could rival the original build cost. Land and a roof don't build a ship. The fit-out is where the real working capital went, and it went into two things: tools and timber. Tools were the smaller cost, but not a trivial one. A shipwright's kit, broadaxes, adzes, augers for drilling plank fastening holes, saws, caulking irons, mallets, and measuring tools, represented a skilled craftsman's accumulated personal investment, often built up over a full apprenticeship rather than bought at once. Guild inventories from comparable Venetian artisan trades suggest a full basic toolkit for one master carpenter cost somewhere around 3 to 6 ducats, a few weeks' wages, not a fortune, but tools were maintained and sharpened constantly, not treated as disposable. Timber was the real capital sink, and it's the first place where the business becomes fragile. Oak for frames and keel, larch or fir for planking and masts, had to be seasoned, dried, and cured for months before it could be reliably worked, which meant a functioning yard needed timber stockpiled a full season ahead of when it would actually be cut into a hull. For a mid-sized merchant vessel, contemporary estimates of Venetian shipbuilding put total timber requirements at several hundred trees worth of oak and pine, sourced largely from the Republic's own managed forests in the Cadore region of the Alps, floated down the Piave River to the lagoon. A yard building even 1 or 2 vessels a year needed a standing timber inventory worth easily 100 to 200 ducats, sitting in the yard, unsold, doing nothing but seasoning and being a fire risk. That's before wages, before pitch, before iron nails and fittings, all of which also had to be pre-purchased and stored. Add pitch and tar for waterproofing, oakum fiber for caulking the seams, iron for nails, bolts, and rudder fittings, and the fit-out bill climbs further still. Reconstructed estimates for these secondary materials on a single mid-sized vessel run to several dozen additional ducats, sourced from suppliers the yard had no direct control over. Altogether, a new owner opening a squero from nothing, before a single customer had paid a deposit, was likely committing something in the neighborhood of 150 to 250 ducats in tools and standing inventory. 4 to 8 years of an ordinary journeyman's wages, tied up and sitting exposed to fire, rot, and theft before it earned a soldo back. A working squero ran on a small, tiered crew, and almost none of it was casual hired that morning labor. This trade had a guild structure precisely because the skills took years to build and the guilds controlled who was allowed to sell them. At the top sat the master shipwright, the Marengan da Nave, who owned or leased the yard and directed the build. Below him, journeyman carpenters and caulkers, the caliphai, whose entire specialty was driving oakum fiber into hull seams and sealing them with hot pitch, a separate guild in its own right in Venice because a badly caulked hull sank. Journeymen earned that 20 to 32 soldi daily wage Lane's records document, paid by the working day, which meant the owner's labor cost scaled directly with how much work he could keep flowing. No work, no wage owed, but also no crew standing by loyally when the next contract came in. Below the journeymen, apprentices, often the master's own sons or nephews, or boys bonded into the guild for a multi-year term, worked for food, lodging, and training rather than a wage, which functioned as the yard's cheapest labor but also its slowest maturing asset. A 12-year-old apprentice was a cost center for years before he became a productive one. Add the family itself. A squero owner's wife commonly managed the household accounts and fed the crew as part of the deal, an unpaid labor input that doesn't show up in any surviving ledger but was absolutely part of the cost structure. The medieval equivalent of a small business running on an unpaid spouse's bookkeeping, which is to say, exactly like a huge share of small businesses today. The real cost most people miss isn't the wage line, it's the lost flexibility. A master who kept 2 or 3 journeymen on retainer through a slow winter to make sure they'd be there when spring contracts arrived was paying for certainty, not for labor performed that week. That's a cost with no output, and it's the same bet every modern business owner makes when they keep skilled staff on payroll through a slow quarter rather than losing them to a competitor. There's also a housing and feeding cost baked into apprentice labor that never appears as a wage but was very real. Guild rules across most Italian city-states obligated a master to house, feed, and clothe his bonded apprentices for the duration of the term, which meant every mouth in the yard was drawing against the household's food budget, whether or not there was a contract to justify it. A master who took on too many apprentices in a good year, tempted by the cheap labor, could find himself feeding a crew of teenagers through a bad one with no work to give them. Every input this business depended on had a failure point, and none of them were under the shipyard owner's control. Timber was the biggest one. The Republic of Venice treated its alpine forests as a strategic state resource, specifically because shipbuilders, private and state alike, depended on them, and state regulation of logging quotas and export could tighten supply overnight for reasons that had nothing to do with the squero owner's own business. A bad season for river transport on the Piave, a state requisition of timber for the arsenal during a war scare, or simply a run of ships being built by every yard at once, could push seasoned oak prices up sharply with no warning, and a yard that hadn't stockpiled the year before was stuck bidding for scarce wood against everyone else. Pitch and tar, essential for caulking and hull preservation, came largely from further afield, pine forest regions, sometimes imported through Adriatic or Baltic trade routes, which meant a shipyard's caulking schedule was hostage to shipping routes it had no part in running. Iron for nails and fittings depended on ore and smithing capacity elsewhere in the mainland. Every one of these was a middleman relationship, and every middleman relationship was a place where price or availability could move for reasons invisible from the yard floor. And unlike a grain merchant's stock, unused ship timber didn't just sit safely, it was flammable, it warped if stored wrong, and a fire in one shed could take out a season's working capital in an afternoon. Fires in Venetian shipyards and timber stores are documented repeatedly across the medieval and early modern period as one of the most feared risks in the trade, precisely because the product itself was fuel. Skilled labor was its own supply constraint too. The caulkers and carpenters guilds controlled entry into the trade tightly, which protected wages for the men already inside it, but also meant a yard couldn't simply hire its way out of a busy season. If every yard in the city needed extra caulkers at once, ahead of a fleet mobilization, there simply weren't more qualified caulkers to be found. Guild membership having capped the supply for exactly the reason a modern licensing board caps the number of practicing surgeons. The obvious revenue was new construction, building a merchant vessel to order for a ship owner, or a merchant consortium, paid in installments tied to construction milestones, a structure documented in Venetian shipbuilding contracts, because no yard could float the entire cost of materials and labor on its own credit before getting paid. The second, steadier stream was repair and refit work, recalking hulls after a season at sea, replacing storm-damaged planking, restepping masts. This was less glamorous than building a new hull, but far more reliable, because Venice's entire merchant and naval fleet needed constant maintenance, and a yard with a good reputation for caulking could count on repeat customers in a way new build contracts, dependent on someone deciding to commission an entire vessel, never guaranteed. The third stream, and the one most people wouldn't expect, was labor subcontracting to the state arsenal itself. When the Republic needed to surge galley production ahead of a war, or to rebuild a fleet after a naval defeat, the arsenal's own permanent workforce, however large, sometimes couldn't scale fast enough, and the state contracted overflow work to private squeri and their crews. This wasn't charity, it paid at rates set by the state, and it came with the prestige and follow-on business of having worked for the Republic's own war fleet. For a well-connected master shipwright, a single mobilization contract with the arsenal could be worth more than a full ordinary year of private commissions. The state customer, not the merchant customer, was often the most valuable revenue stream the yard had. precisely because it was the one most owners weren't positioned to win. Layer on top of these three a smaller, steadier fourth stream that rarely gets mentioned, selling offcuts. Wood shavings, sawdust, and short offcuts from framing timber had real value to the city's bakers and lime burners as fuel, and to smaller boat builders as material for oars, tool handles, and fittings too small to need full planks. It wasn't a stream that made anyone rich, but in a business where every ducat of working capital was already stretched thin, turning literal waste product into cash flow mattered more than its small size suggests. The same instinct that has a modern lumber yard selling sawdust to a mulch supplier, rather than paying to haul it away. By this point, you've got scarce waterfront land, a shed that eats a laborer's wage years, a timber stockpile that can burn down in an afternoon, a crew you're paying to sit idle in winter, and supply chains you don't control running through the Alps and the Adriatic. It sounds like a business built to fail. Here's why people ran it anyway. Split this business by vantage point, and the picture changes completely. The waterfront landlord, the confraternity or noble family leasing out the site, took a fixed or lightly variable rent, bore none of the timber fire risk, none of the crew idle in winter risk, and none of the price swing risk on oak and pitch. Their return was smaller per ducat of asset value, but close to guaranteed, the medieval equivalent of owning the building a restaurant operates out of, rather than owning the restaurant. The squareo owner, the master shipwright, took on all of that operating risk in exchange for a much larger potential upside, the margin on an actual completed hull, which after materials and labor could still leave a meaningfully larger cash return than the landlord's rent if the year went well. But if the year went well was doing enormous work in that sentence, because a shipwright had no way to smooth a bad year the way a landlord's rent roll smoothed his. There's a third vantage point worth naming, the merchant who commissioned the vessel in the first place. From his chair, the shipyard was a fixed, contracted cost against a much larger bet, the value of the cargo the finished ship would carry over years of trading voyages. A galley costing 1,500 ducats to build could plausibly earn that back several times over across a single successful spice or cloth run to the eastern Mediterranean. The shipyard's entire risk-laden existence, in other words, existed to serve a customer whose own upside dwarfed the yard's, which is exactly why merchants, not shipwrights, tended to be the richest people standing on the dock at launch. Guild records from the Caliphi, the Venetian caulkers' confraternity, survive specifically because bad caulking was treated as close to a legal offense. A hull that failed at sea because of poor seam sealing wasn't just a lost customer. It could trigger a guild inquiry and personal liability for the master who signed off on the work, since Venetian maritime regulation held shipbuilders accountable for structural failures traceable to shoddy construction. That's a liability exposure with no modern insurance policy behind it. Reputation and craft record were the only protection a shipwright had. Then there's the disaster that needs no embellishment because the date and scale are documented on their own. The Arsenal fire of 1569, well after our period but part of the same continuous shipbuilding culture and forest supply chain, destroyed roughly 4 galleys and a significant stock of stored timber and munitions in a single night. A scale of loss that private squarey, with none of the state's capacity to absorb it, could never have survived intact. A smaller private yard fire, undocumented by name because it wasn't state property and didn't make the chronicles, would simply have ended a family's business. No dramatic date required, just a spark in a shed full of seasoned oak. And then there's the human case, which is where this risk stops being abstract. Picture a master shipwright, call him, as a plausible and clearly illustrative composite rather than a named historical record. Zuan the caulker's son, who takes on a large new build contract for a merchant consortium, fronts the timber cost on credit against the expected milestone payments, and then loses the ship's buyer to bankruptcy mid-construction when a Levantine trading venture the merchant had bet everything on collapses. The half-built hull is worth far less than the timber and labor sunk into it. The yard's credit with the timber merchant is now stretched thin, and a single customer's failure has become the shipyard's own crisis. This is the risk no ledger fully captures. Not that the yard does bad work, but that the yard's fortune is tied to the solvency of people who never picked up a tool. There's a fourth, quieter risk sitting underneath all three of these: regulatory exposure to the state itself. The Republic's dependence on shipbuilding for its own naval survival meant it regulated the trade closely, controlling timber exports, occasionally requisitioning private yard capacity outright during a war emergency, and setting wage ceilings during mobilizations that could squeeze a private owner's margin on state work precisely when demand and his own costs were highest. A business this entangled with the state's military needs was never fully a private actor, even when it was privately owned. None of what follows is a surviving balance sheet. No such document exists intact for a private medieval squero. This is a reconstruction built from the wage, price, and contract data above, laid out as a good year, an average year, and a bad year. In a good year, the yard completes one new merchant vessel and handles a steady stream of repair work and picks up a state subcontract during a fleet mobilization. Revenue might total somewhere around 1,400 to 1,600 ducats across all three streams. Against that, roughly 900 to 1,000 ducats in timber, pitch, iron, and materials. 250 to 300 ducats in journeyman and apprentice wages across the year. Land rent of perhaps 20 to 40 ducats. Net to the owner, somewhere in the range of 150 to 300 ducats, 5 to 10 times an ordinary journeyman's annual wage, which is exactly the kind of multiple that made ownership worth the risk. In an average year, no new build contract materializes, and the yard survives on repair work alone. Revenue drops to perhaps 500 to 700 ducats. Materials and wages scale down with it, since repair work needs less timber and can be done with a smaller crew. But fixed costs, rent, tool maintenance, the crew the owner keeps on to avoid losing them to a competitor, don't fall as fast as revenue does. Net to the owner might be a modest 60 to 120 ducats, a living, not a fortune. In a bad year, a timber price spike from an arsenal requisition, a fire that takes out part of the stockpile, or a defaulting customer like the illustrative case above, the yard could easily post a loss, forced to sell tools or take on debt against next year's expected contracts just to keep the crew fed through winter. This is the year that ends careers, not because the owner was incompetent, but because the business had no reserve built into a structure this thin. Stack 3 or 4 bad years back to back, not an unreasonable run, given how many of the risks above were correlated with the same underlying cause, a war footing that spiked both timber demand and requisition risk at once. And the arithmetic gets brutal fast. A yard could lose more in a single catastrophic season than it had earned across the 2 good years before it, which is exactly the asymmetry that pushed so many squero owners toward the safety of steady repair contracts over the higher margin, higher variance gamble of new construction. The person who got structurally rich in this trade wasn't usually the best shipwright. It was the shipwright who converted his skill into something other people needed access to: contracts, not craftsmanship. Venice's own historical record points repeatedly to master shipwrights who leveraged arsenal connections into standing positions overseeing state contracts, effectively becoming gatekeepers between the private guild labor pool and the Republic's shipbuilding demand, a role documented in the guild's evolving relationship with the state through the 14th and 15th centuries. The wealth wasn't in swinging the adze faster than anyone else. It was in being the name the state called first when it needed to scale production overnight, because that position converted a skilled trade into a monopoly on information, who was available, who was reliable, who could be trusted with state timber, and information monopolies paid better than labor ever did, in the 1400s or now. That's the structural lesson this business teaches better than almost any other in this series. Craft skill set the floor for what a shipwright could earn, but it was never what determined the ceiling. The ceiling belonged to whoever controlled access, to timber, to state contracts, to the waterfront itself, and access, unlike skill, could be inherited, married into, or negotiated for, which is exactly how a merchant family with no shipbuilding talent at all could end up owning the yard that a master craftsman only ever got to run. If you want the next build in this series, subscribe. Next up, we're pricing out what it actually costs to run a medieval bakery, and why the flour was never the expensive part. A medieval shipyard was never really in the business of building ships. It was in the business of surviving long enough between the fire risk, the timber shortage, and the customer who went broke mid-contract, to be standing on the waterline when the next hull was ready to launch, and the fog off the lagoon never once mentioned any of that.